The letter, trembling in Penelope Anderson's hands, bore the elegant script of her fiancé's handwriting, but the words scrawled across the page felt like daggers, piercing straight through her heart as she stood in the dusty main street of Concord, California, on that scorching afternoon in July of 1882. She had traveled 300 miles from San Francisco to surprise Thomas before their wedding next month, only to learn from his own landlady that he had been keeping company with another woman, a saloon singer from Sacramento, and had been doing so for the better part of 6 months, while writing Penelope sweet letters filled with promises and dreams. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound could have, leaving her gasping for breath as tears streamed down her cheeks, her carefully planned future crumbling like sun-baked clay beneath her feet. She stood frozen outside the general store, her traveling trunk at her feet, her face flushed with humiliation and grief as townspeople passed by with curious glances. Penelope had saved every penny from her seamstress work to afford the train ticket and the beautiful ivory silk for her wedding dress, fabric that now seemed to mock her from where it lay carefully wrapped in her luggage. At 23 years old, she had believed Thomas Montgomery was the answer to her prayers, a respectable clerk with ambitions of opening his own mercantile, a man who had courted her properly and spoken of building a life together. Now she understood that every word had been a lie, every promise as empty as the desert wind. "Miss, are you all right?" A deep voice broke through her spiraling thoughts, and Penelope looked up to see a tall man with sun-bronzed skin and concerned hazel eyes studying her from beneath the brim of a worn Stetson hat. He wore dusty chaps over well-worn denim, a faded blue shirt, and boots that had clearly walked many miles. A bandana hung loose around his neck, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who spent more time under open skies than beneath roofs. "I am fine," Penelope managed, though her voice cracked on the words and fresh tears threatened to spill over. The cowboy glanced at her trunk, then back at her tear-stained face, and something in his expression softened. "You do not look fine, if you will pardon me saying so. You look like someone who just got their world turned upside down." Penelope let out a bitter laugh that bordered on a sob. "You have no idea." "Actually, I might," he said gently. "Name is Grant Jackson. I work the cattle ranch about 5 miles north of town. Been coming into Concord for supplies for near about 7 years now, and I have learned to recognize heartbreak when I see it." Something about his straightforward honesty and the genuine concern in his eyes made Penelope's carefully maintained composure finally shatter completely. "I came here to surprise my fiancé, only to discover he has been unfaithful, carrying on with another woman for months while planning to marry me. The landlady told me everything before I could even knock on his door. She thought I already knew, thought I was the other woman." Grant's jaw tightened, and anger flashed briefly in his eyes before he schooled his expression back to careful neutrality. "That is a terrible thing to do to anyone, especially to someone as clearly devoted as you must have been to travel all this way." "I feel like such a fool," Penelope whispered, wiping at her eyes with trembling fingers. "How could I have been so blind?" "You were not blind," Grant said firmly. "You were trusting. There is nothing foolish about believing someone you love when they make promises. The fault lies entirely with him, not with you." Penelope looked at this stranger, who spoke with such conviction, and something in her chest loosened slightly. "I do not even know where to go now. I spent most of my savings on the journey here. I was supposed to stay with Thomas until the wedding, and then we were going to find a house together." Grant was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking. Then he said, "The boarding house 2 streets over is run by Mrs. Margaret Chen, a widow who came here during the gold rush with her husband. She is fair and kind, and she will not charge you more than is reasonable. Let me help you get your trunk there, at least. You should not be standing in the street like this." Penelope knew she should refuse, should maintain some semblance of propriety, but the genuine kindness in this cowboy's offer and the complete absence of anywhere else to turn made her nod gratefully. "Thank you, Mr. Jackson. That is very kind of you." Grant picked up her trunk as if it weighed nothing at all, settling it on one broad shoulder. "Call me Grant, please. And you are?" "Penelope Anderson," she replied, falling into step beside him as he began walking down the dusty street. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and she was acutely aware of how disheveled she must look after hours of travel followed by devastating news. "Well, Miss Anderson, I'm sorry we are meeting under such circumstances, but I'm glad I happened along when I did." They walked in silence for a few minutes, passing the blacksmith shop where the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil rang out, and a dry goods store with faded advertisements in the window. Concord was a modest town, clearly prospering from the nearby ranches and the railroad that had come through several years prior. The buildings were a mix of weathered wood and newer construction, and the streets showed the constant battle between civilization and the wild California landscape that surrounded them. Mrs. Chen's boarding house turned out to be a 2-story structure with a wide front porch and flower boxes that somehow bloomed despite the heat. A Chinese woman in her 50s answered Grant's knock, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Mr. Grant, you're back in town. Is your boss needing more supplies already?" "Actually, Mrs. Chen, I'm here on different business today. This is Miss Penelope Anderson, and she finds herself in need of a room. I was hoping you might have one available." Mrs. Chen's sharp eyes took in Penelope's red-rimmed eyes, and distress stayed immediately, and her expression shifted to one of maternal concern. Of course. Come in, dear. I have a lovely room on the 2nd floor that overlooks the garden." "I should tell you," Penelope said hesitantly, "I do not have unlimited funds. I will need to find work quickly to pay for my keep." Mrs. Chen waved a hand dismissively. "We will work something out. You look like you have had a terrible day, and no one should have to worry about money on top of whatever else is troubling them. Come, let me show you the room, and then I will make you some tea." Grant carried the trunk upstairs behind Mrs. Chen, and Penelope followed on unsteady legs. The room was simple but clean, with a comfortable-looking bed covered in a quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, a small wardrobe, and a window that did indeed overlook a surprisingly lush garden where vegetables and herbs grew in neat rows. After Grant set down the trunk, he tipped his hat to both women. "I will leave you to get settled, Miss Anderson. Mrs. Chen will take good care of you." "Thank you," Penelope said, meaning it with her whole heart. "You have been incredibly kind to a complete stranger." "Sometimes strangers are exactly who we need," Grant replied with a small smile. "I hope things start looking up for you." After he left, Mrs. Chen sat Penelope down and gently extracted the whole story while preparing tea with herbs from her garden. The older woman listened without judgment, occasionally making sympathetic sounds, but mostly just letting Penelope talk until all the hurt and betrayal came pouring out. "Men like that are cowards," Mrs. Chen finally said when Penelope had exhausted herself. "They want the safety of a respectable marriage and the excitement of forbidden romance, with no thought to the damage they cause. My husband, he was a good man. He never looked at another woman from the day we married until the day he died. That is how it should be." "How do you know who to trust?" Penelope asked miserably. "I thought Thomas was good and honest. I thought I knew him." "Sometimes you cannot know," Mrs. Chen admitted. "But that does not mean you should stop trusting altogether. It means you trust carefully, and you watch for consistency between words and actions. A man who truly loves you will show it in 100 small ways every day, not just in pretty letters." Over the next few days, Penelope slowly began to piece herself back together. She sent a tersely worded telegram to Thomas informing him that she knew everything and their engagement was terminated, then tried to put him from her mind entirely. Mrs. Chen proved to be an invaluable ally, helping Penelope find work as a seamstress with the town's tailor, Mr. Jameson, who was overwhelmed with orders and grateful for skilled help. Penelope threw herself into the work, finding solace in the familiar rhythm of needle and thread in creating beauty from fabric. The women of Concord appreciated her fine stitching and eye for detail, and soon she had several private commissions as well. The work helped distract her from the ache in her chest, though late at night, alone in her room, she sometimes allowed herself to cry for the future she had lost. She saw Grant Jackson several times over the following weeks. He came into town regularly for supplies, and he always made a point of stopping by to check on her, asking how she was settling in and if she needed anything. His kindness never felt invasive or pushy, just genuine concern from someone who had witnessed her at her lowest point. "You are looking better," he observed one afternoon when they happened to cross paths outside the post office. "More color in your cheeks." "I am keeping busy," Penelope replied, Work helps. It does, Grant agreed, though it is important to let yourself feel things too, not just bury them under busyness. Penelope was surprised by the insight. You sound like you speak from experience. Grant was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. I was engaged once, about 4 years ago. Her name was Catherine, and I thought we wanted the same things out of life. Turned out she wanted a rancher who spent his evenings in a fancy parlor, not one who actually worked the land and came home covered in dust and smelling like horses. She ended up leaving me for a banker in Sacramento. It hurt like hell at the time, but looking back, I am grateful she showed her true self before we made vows that would have trapped us both. Penelope felt a surge of empathy for this kind cowboy who had suffered his own betrayal. Better to know before vows, she said softly. Exactly, Grant said, meeting her eyes. Better a sharp pain now than a lifetime of slow misery. It does not make it hurt less in the moment, but it is still the truth. How long did it take before it stopped hurting? Penelope asked. Grant considered the question seriously. Hard to say exactly. The sharp edge of it faded after a few months. The whole thing stopped mattering much after about a year. Now, I barely think about her at all, except as a lesson learned. You will get there too, Miss Anderson, I promise. Something about the way he spoke, with such quiet certainty and compassion, made Penelope believe him. For the first time since learning of Thomas's betrayal, she felt a genuine spark of hope that she might actually heal from this. As summer deepened into August, Penelope found herself looking forward to Grant's visits to town. They developed an easy friendship, often sharing a meal at the small restaurant near the general store or taking evening walks when the heat finally broke. Grant told her about life on the ranch where he worked for a man named Robert Johnson, describing the endless work of tending cattle, mending fences, and dealing with the unpredictable challenges of ranch life. Why do you do it? Penelope asked one evening as they strolled past the church at the edge of town. It sounds exhausting. Because I love it, Grant said simply. I love being outside, working with my hands, seeing the direct results of my labor. I love the animals and the land. I love the freedom of it. No 2 days are exactly the same, and I answer to the work itself, not to some arbitrary rules made up by men in offices who never set foot outdoors. The passion in his voice was unmistakable, and Penelope found herself drawn to his genuine enthusiasm. Thomas had always talked about success in terms of money and social standing, but Grant spoke about meaning and purpose and connection to something larger than himself. That sounds wonderful, she said honestly. I envy you that certainty about what you want from life. What do you want? Grant asked, stopping to look at her in the fading golden light. Penelope had to think about it. I used to think I wanted a respectable marriage, a comfortable home, perhaps children someday, the things women are supposed to want. But now I'm not sure. Maybe I just wanted those things because I thought I should, not because they would actually make me happy. What makes you happy right now in this moment? Grant pressed gently. Penelope looked around at the dusty street, at the purple sky above them as sunset approached, at Grant's earnest face waiting patiently for her answer. This, she said finally. Having work I am good at, work that matters to people, making my own decisions, not being beholden to anyone else's expectations, and honest conversations with someone who actually listens. Grant smiled, and it transformed his whole face, making him look younger and lighter. Those are good things to want, Penelope. Real things. It was the first time he had used her first name instead of Miss Anderson, and something warm unfurled in Penelope's chest at the sound of it in his low voice. She realized with a start that she was beginning to care for this cowboy, this kind and honest man who had appeared in her life at its darkest moment. The realization terrified her. How could she trust her own judgment after being so wrong about Thomas? How could she risk her heart again when it was still healing from the last betrayal? As if sensing her sudden anxiety, Grant said, "You have gone quiet. Did I say something wrong?" "No," Penelope said quickly. "I was just thinking." "About what?" She decided on honesty. "About how I do not trust myself anymore. About how I thought I knew Thomas, thought I could see his character clearly, and I was completely wrong. What if my judgment is broken? What if I am just destined to make the same mistakes over and over?" Grant stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his expression serious. You were not wrong about his character, Penelope. He deliberately deceived you. There is no way to protect yourself from someone who is determined to lie to you except by never trusting anyone at all, and that is no way to live. The fact that you were fooled by a skilled liar does not mean your judgment is broken. It means he was a coward who hid his true self. How can I know the difference? Penelope asked, hearing the desperation in her own voice. Time, Grant said. Consistency over time. Actions matching words, not just once or twice, but constantly. And trusting your instincts when something feels off, even if you cannot point to concrete proof. You probably had doubts about Thomas at some point, little nagging feelings you pushed aside because everything seemed fine on the surface. Penelope thought back and realized he was right. There had been moments when Thomas's excuses for missed visits or delayed letters had felt thin, times when his enthusiasm for their wedding plans had seemed forced. She had dismissed those feelings as her own anxiety, her own flaws. She had ignored her instincts in favor of the story she wanted to be true. You are right, she admitted. There were signs. I just did not want to see them. That is human nature, Grant said gently. We all do it. The trick is learning to pay attention to those uncomfortable feelings instead of explaining them away. They resumed walking, and Penelope felt something shift inside her. Not healing exactly. Not yet, but a willingness to believe that healing might be possible. Over the following weeks, Penelope began to truly observe Grant, testing his consistency the way he had suggested. She noticed how he always did exactly what he said he would do, how he showed up when expected and sent word ahead if he would be delayed. She noticed how he treated everyone with respect regardless of their station, from Mrs. Chen to the Chinese laborers who worked on the railroad, to the Mexican ranch hands he sometimes came to town with. She noticed how he listened more than he spoke, how he asked questions and actually cared about the answers. Most significantly, she noticed how he never pushed her for more than she was ready to give. He seemed content with friendship, with their easy conversations and shared meals. He never tried to rush her healing or suggest that she should be over Thomas by now. He simply existed as a steady, reliable presence in her life, asking nothing in return. September arrived with slightly cooler temperatures and the first hints that summer's brutal grip might eventually relent. Penelope had been in Concord for 2 months, and it was beginning to feel like home in a way San Francisco never had. She had friends now, women who came to her for sewing and stayed to chat, who invited her to church socials and quilting circles. She had meaningful work and her own money and the freedom to make her own choices. She also had Grant, though she was still uncertain exactly what to call what they had. More than friendship, she suspected, but neither of them had spoken of it directly. That changed on a warm Saturday evening when Grant asked if she would like to see the ranch where he worked. It is beautiful this time of year, he said. The hills are still golden, and the cattle are fat and healthy. Boss does not mind visitors, and I think you might enjoy getting out of town for a bit. Penelope agreed, curious to see this place Grant spoke of so often. The next morning, he arrived with a gentle mare for her to ride, and they set out in the cool, early light before the sun could climb too high. The ride itself was pleasant, following a well-worn trail that wound through rolling hills dotted with oak trees. Grant pointed out landmarks and told stories about various adventures he had experienced over his years working the land. Penelope found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the horse beneath her, enjoying the openness of the landscape and the easy flow of Grant's narration. The ranch spread out across a valley with several large barns, a bunkhouse, the main house, and endless fenced pastures where cattle grazed peacefully. Grant introduced her to his boss, Mr. Johnson, a gruff but kind man in his 60s who clearly respected Grant's work ethic and abilities. "This boy is the best hand I have ever employed," Mr. Johnson told Penelope while Grant went to check on something in the barn. "Honest as the day is long, works harder than any 3 men combined, and the animals trust him like he can speak their language. I keep telling him he should think about getting his own place someday, but he claims he is happy here." When Grant returned, he showed Penelope around the property, pointing out the various aspects of ranch operation, with obvious pride. She could see how much this life suited him, how natural he looked moving among the animals and the equipment, completely in his element. They ate lunch in the shade of a massive oak tree, sharing bread and cheese and apples while looking out over the valley. The breeze was gentle, carrying the scent of dry grass and cattle, and Penelope felt more at peace than she had in months. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said. "It is beautiful, and I understand now why you love it so much." Grant looked pleased. "I'm glad you like it. I wanted you to see this part of my life, to understand what I meant about loving the work." "It suits you," Penelope said. "You look different here than you do in town, more yourself somehow." "I feel more myself here," Grant admitted. "Town is necessary for supplies and socializing, but this is where I belong." He paused, then added quietly, "I wanted you to see it because I hope you might come to like it enough to visit regularly. If you wanted to, I mean." Penelope's heart began to beat faster. "Are you saying what I think you are saying?" Grant turned to look at her directly, his hazel eyes warm and open. "I am saying that these past 2 months getting to know you have been some of the best of my life. I am saying that I admire your strength and your skill and your willingness to rebuild after being torn down. I am saying that I find myself thinking about you constantly, hoping to run into you in town, looking forward to our conversations more than anything else in my week." Penelope felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were not tears of pain this time. "Grant, I care for you too. Quite a lot, actually. But I'm frightened. I was so wrong about Thomas, and I do not want to make another terrible mistake." "Then do not rush," Grant said reasonably. "Take all the time you need to be sure. I am not going anywhere, Penelope. I will be here whether you need another month or another year or longer. I would rather wait forever and have you be certain than rush you into something you are not ready for." The simple sincerity of his words, the patience and understanding, made something crack open in Penelope's chest. Here was a man who truly saw her, who respected her fears and her timeline, who was willing to let her set the pace. Here was someone whose words matched his actions, day after day, week after week, without fail. "I do not need forever," she heard herself say. "I just needed to be sure I was not imagining things, not seeing what I wanted to see instead of what was really there. But I have been watching you, Grant. I have been testing what you say against what you do, and they always match. You are exactly who you present yourself to be, and that person is someone I very much want to spend more time with." Grant's face broke into a wide, genuine smile. "So you will let me court you properly? Take you to church socials and town events as a couple? Let me write you letters and call on you like a respectable suitor?" "Yes," Penelope said, feeling lighter than she had in months. "Yes to all of that." Grant reached out and took her hand, his palm warm and calloused against her softer skin. "I promise you right now, Penelope, I will never lie to you. I will never pretend to be something I am not. If this does not work out, it will be because we genuinely are not suited, not because I deceived you about who I am or what I want." "What do you want?" Penelope asked, echoing the question he had once asked her. "I want a partner," Grant said thoughtfully. "Someone to build a life with, not someone to manage or control or keep in a box. I want honest conversations and shared goals. I want someone who loves this land the way I do, or who at least understands why I love it, and I want someone who challenges me to be better, who sees me clearly and chooses me anyway." "That sounds wonderful," Penelope whispered. "I think you might be that person," Grant said, squeezing her hand gently. "But we will take our time finding out, together." The ride back to Concord that evening felt different than the morning journey. The landscape looked more beautiful, the cooling air more pleasant, and the man riding beside her seemed to glow with possibility. Penelope realized she was humming softly to herself, something she had not done since before learning of Thomas's betrayal. When Grant left her at Mrs. Chen's door, he kissed her hand formally and promised to call on her in 2 days when he returned to town. Penelope floated up the stairs to her room, feeling as if the weight she had been carrying for months had finally begun to lift. Mrs. Chen caught her in the hallway, taking one look at her face and breaking into a knowing smile. "The cowboy?" "The cowboy," Penelope confirmed, unable to stop grinning. "Good," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "That one is solid. That one will not break your heart." Over the following weeks, Grant proved Mrs. Chen right. He courted Penelope with steady dedication, showing up exactly when he said he would, writing her thoughtful letters when he could not come to town, and always treating her with respect and genuine interest. He asked about her work, her dreams, her thoughts on everything from politics to poetry. He introduced her to his friends and made an effort to get to know hers. He never pressured her physically, content with hand-holding and the occasional chaste kiss on the cheek or forehead. Most importantly, when Penelope had moments of doubt or anxiety, triggered by some random reminder of Thomas's betrayal, Grant never became defensive or impatient. Instead, he listened to her fears, validated them, and then gently reminded her of all the evidence that he was not Thomas, that their relationship was built on entirely different foundations. "Trust takes time," he told her one evening when she apologized for her lingering insecurities. "Especially when that trust has been badly damaged. I do not mind being patient, Penelope. You are worth the wait." By the time October arrived, painting the oak trees in shades of gold and russet, Penelope realized she had fallen deeply in love with Grant Jackson. It was different from what she had felt for Thomas, less desperate and anxious, more peaceful and certain. With Thomas, she had always been trying to fit herself into the shape he wanted, adapting and accommodating. With Grant, she could simply be herself, and he loved her for it. She told him so one Sunday afternoon as they sat together at the edge of town, watching the sun sink toward the western hills. "I love you," she said simply. "I think I have for a while now, but I was too frightened to admit it." "I am not frightened anymore." Grant turned to her, his face full of such open joy that it took her breath away. "I love you too, Penelope. I think I started falling for you that very first day when you stood in the street with your world falling apart and still managed to maintain your dignity and strength. I have only fallen harder every day since." He kissed her then, properly, and Penelope felt as if every broken piece inside her had finally snapped back into place. This was what love was supposed to feel like, she realized, safe and exciting at the same time, grounding and uplifting, certain and full of wonderful possibility. When they finally pulled apart, Grant said, "I know it has not been very long by conventional standards, but I am not getting any younger, and I know what I want. Will you marry me, Penelope? Not right away if you are not ready, but someday soon?" Penelope's eyes filled with happy tears. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you, Grant Jackson." They decided on a wedding date in December, giving themselves 2 months to prepare and allowing Penelope time to make her own dress from the ivory silk she had originally purchased for her wedding to Thomas. Repurposing the fabric felt symbolic somehow, taking something meant for a false future and transforming it into something for a true one. The waiting period also gave them time to make practical arrangements. Mr. Johnson, delighted by the news, offered Grant a small cabin on the ranch property that had been sitting empty. It needed work, but Grant and Penelope spent their free time fixing it up together, painting walls and mending the roof and making plans for curtains and furniture. Working side by side on the cabin, Penelope discovered a domestic compatibility she had never experienced with Thomas. They made decisions together easily, compromising when their preferences differed, and laughing over mistakes. Grant taught her how to use a hammer properly, and she taught him how to hem curtains. They fell into natural rhythms, understanding instinctively when to push forward and when to rest, when to talk, and when to enjoy comfortable silence. In November, Penelope received a letter from her mother in San Francisco, who had finally heard about the broken engagement to Thomas. Her mother expressed concern and disappointment, having been quite pleased with Thomas's prospects and respectability. Penelope wrote back carefully, explaining what had happened and telling her about Grant. Her mother's response was cautious. "A cowboy," she wrote. "Darling, I worry that you are rushing into something in reaction to your heartbreak. Perhaps you should take more time. Come home to San Francisco and consider your options more carefully." Penelope showed the letter to Grant, who read it without comment before handing it back. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to marry you in December exactly as we planned," Penelope said firmly. "My mother means well, but she does not understand that this is not a reaction to heartbreak. This is me building a real life with someone who actually sees me and values me." "I want your family to approve," Grant said carefully. "I do not want to come between you and your mother." "You are not coming between us," Penelope assured him. "She will understand eventually once she meets you. And if she does not, well, I am a grown woman making my own choices." She wrote back to her mother inviting her to the wedding and hoping she would choose to attend, but making it clear that the wedding would happen regardless. To her relief, her mother eventually wrote back agreeing to come, though the letter was full of maternal worry and caution. December 20th, 1882, dawned clear and cold, with frost sparkling on the ground and breath misting in the early morning air. Penelope dressed carefully in the ivory silk gown she had remade, its simple, elegant lines suiting her far better than the fussy design she had originally planned for her wedding to Thomas. Mrs. Chen helped arrange her hair and lent her a beautiful jade necklace for luck. The ceremony took place in Concord's small church, with most of the town in attendance. Mr. Johnson stood up as Grant's best man, and Mrs. Chen served as Penelope's matron of honor. Penelope's mother sat in the front row, looking skeptical, but at least present. When Penelope walked down the aisle and saw Grant waiting for her at the altar, looking handsome and slightly nervous in his best suit, her heart felt so full she thought it might burst. This was right. She knew with absolute certainty. This was what she was always meant to find, even if she had to walk through betrayal and heartbreak to get here. The Reverend kept the ceremony simple and heartfelt. When it came time for vows, Grant looked into Penelope's eyes and spoke in a clear, steady voice. "I promise to love you honestly, to work beside you as a true partner, to listen when you speak and value your thoughts and dreams as much as my own. I promise to show you through my actions every day that you made the right choice in trusting me with your heart, and I promise that you will never have cause to doubt my faithfulness or my commitment to the life we are building together." Penelope felt tears slip down her cheeks as she made her own vows. "I promise to trust you even when old fears try to make me doubt. I promise to love you for exactly who you are, not who I might want you to be. I promise to work beside you in building our life, to face challenges together, and to always choose honesty even when it is difficult. And I promise to remind you every day how grateful I am that you walked into my life when I needed someone most." When the Reverend pronounced them married and Grant kissed her, the small church erupted in applause and cheers. Penelope laughed against Grant's lips, feeling pure, uncomplicated joy for the first time in longer than she could remember. The reception took place at the town hall, with food prepared by seemingly half of Concord and music provided by a fiddle player and a guitarist. Penelope's mother cornered her early in the evening, pulling her aside for a private conversation. "I was skeptical," her mother admitted. "I thought you were making a mistake born of hurt pride and a desire to prove something. But watching the way that man looks at you, the way he stays close but never crowds you, the way he introduces you to everyone with such obvious pride, I'm beginning to think you might have found something real." "I have, Mother," Penelope said gently. "I know his circumstances are more modest than Thomas's were, but Grant is worth 100 Thomas Montgomerys. He is honest and kind and hard-working, and he loves me for who I actually am." Her mother sighed but smiled. "Then I am happy for you, darling, truly, and I am sorry for doubting." They embraced, and Penelope felt another piece of her life click into place. She had her mother's blessing, however reluctantly given, and that mattered more than she had wanted to admit. As the evening wore on, Grant and Penelope danced and laughed and accepted congratulations from everyone they knew. Mrs. Chen cried happy tears and told them they were going to have a beautiful life together. Mr. Johnson shook Grant's hand firmly and told him to take a week off for a proper honeymoon. The other ranch hands teased Grant good-naturedly while making sure Penelope knew that Grant had been walking around with a ridiculous smile for months. Late in the evening, Grant pulled Penelope outside for a moment of quiet. The December night was cold and clear, stars blazing overhead in the unpolluted sky. "Happy?" he asked, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. "Incredibly," Penelope replied, leaning into his warmth. "Are you?" "Beyond words," Grant said. "You know, that day I found you crying in the street, I never imagined it would lead here. I just wanted to help someone who looked like they needed it. But you have become the most important person in my life, Penelope. You have made me happier than I ever thought possible." "Better to know before vows," Penelope quoted softly, thinking of Thomas's betrayal and how it had led her to this moment. "That is what you told me, remember? About being grateful your first engagement ended before marriage. You were right. If Thomas had not shown his true nature when he did, I never would have come to Concord. I never would have met you, As much as it hurt at the time, I am grateful for it now because it brought me here. Grant pulled her closer, resting his chin on top of her head. I am grateful too, then, for both of our heartbreaks that taught us what to look for, what really matters. And I'm grateful you trusted me enough to try again. They stood together in the cold California night, newly married and full of hope for the future they would build together. Inside, the celebration continued, but out here, it was just the two of them and the vast starlit sky and the absolute certainty that they had found something worth keeping. The weeks following the wedding settled into a comfortable pattern as Penelope adjusted to life on the ranch. The small cabin that Grant had repaired became their home, cozy and intimate with the furniture they had collected together and the curtains Penelope had sewn. She continued her seamstress work, with women from town and the surrounding ranches seeking her out for their sewing needs. Grant continued his work with the cattle, often leaving before dawn and returning at sunset, tired but content. Penelope discovered that she loved ranch life far more than she had expected. She learned to tend a garden, growing vegetables and herbs with advice from Mrs. Chen and the other ranch wives. She learned to care for chickens, collecting eggs each morning and occasionally processing birds for dinner. She learned to read the weather in the clouds and the behavior of animals, understanding when storms were coming and when the day would stay clear. Most surprisingly, she learned to ride well, practicing until she could handle a horse confidently enough to occasionally ride out to where Grant was working, bringing him lunch and spending a quiet hour together in the middle of the workday. Those moments became some of her favorites, sitting in the grass watching cattle graze while Grant ate and told her about his morning, both of them content in each other's presence. January and February passed in a blur of work and domesticity. Penelope found herself more fulfilled than she had ever been in San Francisco, where she had lived with her mother and worked in a large dress shop with a dozen other seamstresses. Here, her work felt more personal, her relationships deeper, her purpose clearer. She and Grant talked late into the evenings, sharing their thoughts and dreams with the ease that came from complete trust. They discussed everything from philosophical questions to silly observations, from serious plans for their future to ridiculous stories from their pasts. Penelope discovered that Grant had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh until her sides ached. Grant discovered that Penelope had strong opinions on nearly everything and loved nothing more than a good-spirited debate. Their physical relationship deepened as well, with the awkwardness of the first few nights giving way to genuine intimacy and pleasure. Penelope had approached the wedding night with some anxiety, having only vague ideas of what to expect. But Grant had been patient and attentive, making sure she felt safe and cherished. She discovered that loving someone you truly trusted made all the difference, transforming what might have been merely obligation into something beautiful and connecting. By March, Penelope realized she was pregnant. The signs were unmistakable, and a visit to the doctor in town confirmed it. She told Grant that evening as they sat together after dinner, and his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He pulled her into his arms, laughing and crying at the same time, telling her over and over how happy he was, how grateful, how much he already loved their child. "We are really doing this," Penelope said wonderingly. "Building a whole life together, a family." "We really are," Grant agreed, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "Our baby will grow up here, learning to ride and work the land, surrounded by people who care about them. They will know what a real partnership looks like because they will see us every day. They will understand that love is about respect and honesty and choosing each other over and over again. They will know they are wanted and loved," Penelope added. "No matter what else happens, they will always know that." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through spring and summer. Penelope continued her sewing work as long as she felt able, then gradually reduced her hours as her belly grew, and the heat of August made everything more difficult. Grant became almost comically protective, worrying over her constantly and trying to prevent her from doing anything too strenuous. "I am pregnant, not fragile," Penelope told him one day when he tried to stop her from hanging laundry. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time. I will tell you if I need help." "I know," Grant said sheepishly. "I just want to make sure you and the baby are safe." "We are safe," Penelope assured him, softening at his obvious concern. "You take excellent care of us, but I also need to stay active and useful. It helps me feel better." Grant learned to balance his worry with respect for her autonomy, checking in without hovering, offering help without insisting. It was, Penelope thought, typical of their whole relationship. They navigated challenges by talking through them, finding compromises that honored both their needs. In early November, with the weather cooling and the hills turning gold again, Penelope went into labor. Mrs. Chen attended her along with the doctor, while Grant paced outside the cabin looking sick with worry. The labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours, but finally, as dawn broke on November 3rd, Penelope delivered a healthy baby boy. When Grant was finally allowed in to meet his son, his eyes were red from crying, and his hands shook as he carefully took the tiny bundle. "He is perfect," he whispered in awe. "Absolutely perfect." They named him William Robert Jackson, William after Penelope's father who had died when she was young, and Robert after Mr. Johnson, who had been so kind to them both. Young William had Grant's hazel eyes and a surprising amount of dark hair, and he seemed content to be held and admired by his exhausted but delighted parents. "I cannot believe he is ours," Penelope said, watching Grant cradle their son with such tender care. "This tiny, perfect person that we made together." "He is the luckiest child alive," Grant said seriously, "because he has you for a mother. You are going to teach him so much, Penelope, kindness and strength and how to stand back up when life knocks you down. And you will teach him honesty and hard work and how to treat people with respect," Penelope replied. "He is lucky to have both of us." The first few months of parenthood were exhausting, but joyful. William was a relatively easy baby, sleeping in long stretches and eating well, but the constant demands of caring for an infant still left both Penelope and Grant feeling perpetually tired. They took turns walking the floor with him during the occasional fussy nights, supporting each other through the difficult moments and celebrating each tiny milestone together. Mr. Johnson gave Grant more flexible hours so he could spend more time at home helping with the baby. The other ranch hands stopped by regularly to meet William and offer congratulations, bringing small gifts and sharing advice from their own experiences with children. Mrs. Chen visited weekly, helping with laundry and cooking while giving Penelope much-needed breaks. Penelope's mother came for a month-long visit when William was 2 months old, and she proved surprisingly helpful despite her earlier skepticism about ranch life. She rocked her grandson for hours, taught Penelope various tricks for soothing a fussy baby, and even admitted to Grant that she had been wrong to doubt the match. "You have built something real here," she told Penelope during a quiet moment while William napped. "A partnership, a home, a family. I can see how happy you are, how fulfilled. I'm sorry I did not understand at first." "It is all right, Mother," Penelope said. "I understand why you worried. But Grant is exactly the kind of man I needed, even if I did not know it at the time." By the time William turned 1, walking unsteadily and babbling constantly, Penelope and Grant had settled into a comfortable rhythm of family life. Grant had been promoted to foreman of the ranch, a position that came with more responsibility, but also better pay and more respect. Penelope had resumed her sewing work part-time, taking on select projects that interested her while still having plenty of time for William. They had also begun saving money with a new goal in mind. Mr. Johnson, now in his late 60s and thinking about retirement, had mentioned the possibility of selling them a portion of the ranch land at a fair price if they wanted to start their own operation. The idea excited them both, the prospect of owning their own place, building something to pass down to William and any future children. "It would be hard work," Grant cautioned one evening as they discussed the possibility. "Harder than what we are doing now. We would be responsible for everything, with no one to fall back on if things went wrong." "But it would be ours," Penelope said. "Our land, our livestock, our future. I think we could do it, Grant. We work well together, and we are both willing to do what it takes." "Then let us start planning seriously," Grant agreed. "If we can save enough in the next 2 years, we might be able to make Mr. Johnson a fair offer." Having a shared goal to work toward energized them both. They budgeted carefully, saved every spare dollar, and researched what they would need to start their own ranch. Grant talked to other ranchers about the challenges and opportunities, learning from their experiences. Penelope calculated costs and profits, using her head for numbers to create realistic projections. When William was 2, Penelope discovered she was pregnant again. This time the news felt less shocking and more like a natural progression of their growing family. Grant was just as excited as he had been the first time, though perhaps slightly less anxious now that he knew what to expect. Their daughter arrived in early spring of 1886, a tiny thing with Penelope's delicate features and a surprisingly loud cry. They named her Rose Margaret Jackson, Rose because Penelope had always loved the flowers, and Margaret after Mrs. Chen, who had been such a constant source of support. William was initially suspicious of his baby sister, unsure why this noisy creature required so much of his parents' attention. But Grant made a point of spending special time with him every day, and Penelope included him in caring for Rose whenever possible, and eventually, William became fiercely protective of his little sister. With 2 children and increasingly serious plans to purchase land from Mr. Johnson, Grant and Penelope entered one of the busiest periods of their lives. They worked constantly, Grant taking on extra projects when he could, and Penelope sewing late into the nights after the children were asleep. But they never lost sight of what mattered most, making time for each other and their family even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them. By the summer of 1887, they had saved enough to approach Mr. Johnson with an offer. To their delight, he agreed to sell them 200 acres on the western edge of his property, along with 20 head of cattle to start their herd. He even offered to hold a portion of the payment as a loan at fair terms, telling them he would rather see the land go to people he trusted than to strangers offering cash. "You two have earned this," he told them. "You have worked harder than anyone I know, and you have done it while raising a family and building a real partnership. I am proud to help you get started." The process of establishing their own ranch was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. They spent months building a larger house for their growing family, working alongside hired hands during the day, and falling into bed exhausted each night. They invested in more cattle, carefully selecting stock that would form the foundation of their herd. They built fences and a barn, dug a well, and planted trees that would someday provide shade and fruit. Through it all, Penelope and Grant maintained the partnership that had defined their relationship from the beginning. They made decisions together, divided labor according to their skills and preferences, and supported each other through frustrations and setbacks. When Grant became discouraged by a difficult calving season, Penelope reminded him how far they had come. When Penelope felt overwhelmed by the constant demands of 2 young children and ranch work, Grant took over evening duties so she could have time to herself. William and Rose grew up surrounded by wide open spaces and the endless work of ranch life. By the time William was 5, he was helping collect eggs and feed chickens. Rose toddled after him, trying to imitate everything her big brother did. The children were healthy and happy, growing strong in the California sunshine. In 1888, when Penelope discovered she was pregnant for a 3rd time, she and Grant both laughed at how their lives had changed since that day in July of 1882 when they had first met. "If someone had told me then that I would end up here, with you, building all of this, I never would have believed them," Penelope said. "Are you glad you did not know?" Grant asked. "Glad you had to take it one step at a time?" "Yes," Penelope said without hesitation. "If I had known everything that was coming, I might have been too frightened to try. But taking it one day at a time, one decision at a time, with you beside me, I never had to face more than I could handle." Their 3rd child, another boy they named James Allen Jackson, arrived in early spring of 1889. With 3 children and a thriving ranch that demanded constant attention, Penelope and Grant's lives were busier than ever. But they had also never been happier or more fulfilled. The ranch continued to grow over the following years. By the early 1890s, they had expanded their herd significantly and had established a reputation for quality cattle and honest dealing. Grant's skills as a rancher had only improved with experience, and Penelope had proven to be as good at managing the business side of the operation as she was at everything else. They hired several permanent hands to help with the work, including a young cowboy who reminded Grant of himself at that age, and a Mexican family who lived in a small house on the property and helped with everything from cattle work to gardening. The ranch became a small community unto itself, with everyone working together toward shared goals. William grew into a serious boy who loved the cattle and spent every moment he could with his father, learning the skills he would need to eventually take over the ranch. Rose proved to have her mother's head for numbers and her father's love of the land, a combination that promised well for her future. James was still young, but already showing signs of being the most adventurous of the three, constantly getting into harmless mischief that made his parents laugh even as they tried to maintain discipline. In 1893, more than a decade after that fateful day when they first met, Grant and Penelope took a rare evening to themselves. They left the children with Mrs. Chen, who was getting older but still sharp and active, and rode out to a favorite spot on their property where a small creek ran through a grove of oak trees. "Do you ever think about how different your life could have been?" Grant asked as they sat together watching the sunset. "If Thomas had not betrayed you? If you had never come to Concord?" Penelope considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," she admitted, "I think about the woman I was then, so certain she knew what she wanted. I feel almost grateful to her for having the courage to travel all that way, even if it was for the wrong reason, because it brought me to the right place eventually." "Do you ever regret how things turned out?" Grant pressed. "Miss the city or wish you had chosen an easier life?" "Never," Penelope said firmly. "Not once. This life is hard work, yes, but it is real and meaningful. I wake up every day knowing exactly why I do what I do. I have a partner who respects me, children who are growing up strong and good, and work that matters. What could I possibly regret about that?" Grant pulled her close, and they sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned pink and gold above them. "I am the luckiest man alive," he said eventually. "That day I saw you crying in the street. Something told me to stop and help. I did not know you would end up being the love of my life, the mother of my children, my partner in building all of this. But I'm so grateful I listened to that instinct." "Better to know before vows," Penelope said softly, the phrase that had once been about pain now transformed into something else entirely. "Thomas's betrayal hurt terribly, but it was necessary. It freed me to find what I really needed instead of settling for what I thought I should want." "And what you really needed was a dusty cowboy with big dreams and rough hands," Grant teased gently. "What I really needed was an honest man who would treat me as an equal," Penelope corrected. "The fact that you also happen to be a dusty cowboy with big dreams and rough hands is just a bonus." Grant laughed, the sound echoing across their land, their home, the life they had built together from heartbreak and hope and hard work. "Come on," he said, standing and offering her his hand. "Let us go collect our children and go home." Penelope took his hand, letting him pull her to her feet. Home, she thought. This ranch, this life, this family, all of it born from the worst day of her life, transforming into the best thing that had ever happened to her. As they rode back toward the house in the gathering twilight, Penelope reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The betrayal that had shattered her in that dusty street in Concord had also opened the door to real love, true partnership, and a life richer than anything she had imagined. Grant had been right all those years ago when he told her the sharp pain of betrayal was better than a lifetime of slow misery. Better to know before vows, before binding yourself to someone who would never truly see you or value you. She had known betrayal, yes, but she had also known healing. She had experienced heartbreak, but she had also discovered what real love looked like. Most importantly, she had learned to trust again, not blindly or foolishly, but carefully and with wisdom, earned through pain. The ranch house came into view, warm light spilling from the windows. Mrs. Chen would have the children ready for bed, probably with some story that would have them giggling despite the late hour. Grant would help settle them while Penelope checked on the animals one last time. Then they would fall into bed together, exhausted but content, ready to do it all again tomorrow. This was the happy ending, Penelope realized. Not a fairy tale conclusion where all problems disappeared, but a real life built on solid foundations of trust and respect and genuine partnership. The work would never end, challenges would always arise, but they would face everything together, just as they always had. Years continued to pass in the rhythm of ranch life. William grew into a fine young man who took over more and more of the daily operations as Grant's back began to protest the decades of hard labor. Rose surprised everyone by developing a talent for training horses, turning it into a profitable side business for the ranch. James eventually left to seek adventure, spending several years working on ranches throughout the West before returning home with a wife and settling on a piece of land adjacent to his parents' property. Grant's hair turned silver at the temples, and Penelope found lines on her face that spoke of years spent squinting in the California sun. But they aged together gracefully, their partnership only deepening with time. They became the couple younger ranchers looked to as an example, the pair who had built something lasting through determination and mutual respect. Mrs. Chen passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1899, and Penelope wept for the woman who had taken her in when she had nowhere else to go. They buried her in the Concord cemetery under an oak tree, with half the town in attendance to mourn a woman who had touched so many lives with her kindness. Mr. Johnson followed a few years later, having lived to see Grant and Penelope's ranch become one of the most successful in the region. His own children had moved east, so he left his remaining land to Grant with the request that he keep it running well. Grant honored that request, managing both properties with the same care and dedication he had always shown. As the new century dawned, bringing changes and innovations that transformed ranching from what it had been in the 1880s, Grant and Penelope adapted and evolved. They installed windmills to pump water more efficiently, invested in better breeding stock, and experimented with new grazing techniques. But the core of what they did remained the same, working the land, raising cattle, building a legacy for their children. On a warm evening in the summer of 1907, Grant and Penelope celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary with their children and grandchildren gathered around. William had married a local girl and given them 2 grandsons. Rose had married the son of another rancher, and they had 3 children of their own. James and his wife had just welcomed their first baby, a little girl they named Penelope after her grandmother. Looking around at the family they had created, the life they had built, Penelope felt overwhelming gratitude for every twist of fate that had brought her to this moment. Even Thomas's betrayal, which had once seemed like the worst thing that could happen, had become just a small, painful chapter in a much larger story of love and growth and triumph. "What are you thinking?" Grant asked, coming to stand beside her on the porch while their family laughed and talked inside. "I am thinking about that day we met," Penelope said. "How lost I felt, how certain I was that my life was ruined, and I'm thinking about how glad I am that I was wrong." Grant wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close in the easy way of long married couples. "Best day of my life, finding you crying in that street." "Best day of mine, too, though I did not know it then," Penelope agreed. She looked up at him, this man who had kept every promise, who had been her partner and lover and friend through 25 years of joy and challenge. "Thank you." "For what?" "For being exactly who you said you were, for being patient while I learned to trust again, for building this life with me, for everything." Grant kissed her forehead gently. "Thank you for taking a chance on a dusty cowboy who was probably too forward with a crying stranger in the street." "You were exactly forward enough," Penelope said with a smile. "Any less and I might not have accepted your help, any more and I would have been frightened away. You were exactly what I needed, exactly when I needed it." They stood together in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the sounds of their family and the land they had worked so hard to build into something lasting. The journey from that painful day in 1882 to this moment of perfect contentment had been long and sometimes difficult, but every step had been worth it. Better to know before Vows, Grant had told her all those years ago. Better to face painful truth than build a life on comfortable lies. He had been right, and Penelope had learned that lesson well. The pain of betrayal had freed her to find real love. The destruction of false dreams had made room for true ones, and the cowboy who had stopped to help a heartbroken stranger had become the foundation of everything good in her life. As the stars began to emerge overhead and their family called them back inside for cake, Penelope took one last moment to appreciate the beautiful improbability of it all. She had come to Concord chasing a false love and found a true one. She had arrived broken and built herself back stronger. She had started with nothing but heartbreak and ended with everything she never knew she needed. That was the real story, she thought, not the betrayal that had brought her here, but the love and partnership that had carried her forward. Not the pain of learning Thomas's true nature, but the joy of discovering Grant's. Not the ending of one dream, but the beginning of something better than she had ever imagined. Hand in hand, Penelope and Grant walked back into the warm glow of their home, surrounded by the family they had created and the legacy they were building. The future stretched out before them, full of grandchildren to spoil and work to be done and quiet evenings spent together reflecting on all they had accomplished. It was, Penelope thought with deep satisfaction, exactly the happily ever after she had always deserved. And it had all started with a cowboy kind enough to help a stranger, wise enough to speak hard truths gently, and patient enough to wait while she learned to trust again. Better to know before vows indeed, because knowing the truth, painful as it had been, had set her free to find the love that had been waiting for her all along.